She had not expected to feel anything when the lawyer read the name. Not after everything. Not after the months of hospital corridors and insurance paperwork and the slow, merciless unwinding of a life she had shared with a man who had promised, in his quiet way, that she would never have to face the world without him. Promises, she had learned, did not survive the bodies that made them. The office was small, too warm, and smelled of leather and old carpet. The kind of room where decisions were delivered rather than made. She sat in a chair that was slightly too deep, her feet barely reaching the floor, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that had nothing to do with calm. Across from her, the attorney adjusted his glasses and opened a folder that looked thinner than she had imagined it would be. And she had told herself on the drive over that whatever was inside, she would accept it without reaction. Dignity cost nothing. She could afford that much. Her name was Clara. Not the kind of name that announced itself in rooms, not the kind that people remembered after a single introduction. It was the kind of name that settled quietly into place, like a stone at the bottom of a riverbed, worn smooth by time and repetition. She had been married for 22 years to a man named Martin, a man who had worked with his hands and spoken with his silences, who had loved her in the measured, dependable way that some people loved houses or land. He had died 4 months earlier, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, in stages, at each one peeling away another layer of the man she knew, until what remained was something neither of them recognized. The funeral had been modest. 14 people attended. 3 of them were neighbors who stayed only long enough to confirm their own health by contrast. The rest were family. Martin's family, who had always treated Clara with a politeness so precise it could only be described as distance. They had never quite forgiven her for being the woman Martin chose over the life they had planned for him. She had never quite stopped noticing. Now she sat in the attorney's office and the folder was open, and the words that came from behind those glasses carried the weight of finality. Martin had left a will. It was not complicated. The house they had rented would remain the landlord's. The truck, still carrying payments, would be returned. The savings account, modest and dwindling, had already been consumed by medical bills that arrived like seasons, predictable and relentless. What remained, the attorney explained with a carefulness that suggested he had delivered this kind of news before, was a property. Clara blinked. She had not known Martin owned property. In 22 years of marriage, through every conversation about money, every late-night discussion about what they could afford and what they could not, he had never once mentioned owning land or a building of any kind. The revelation felt less like a gift and more like a door she had not known existed, opening into a hallway she could not see the end of. The attorney described it in clinical terms. A parcel of land in the eastern part of the county, inherited by Martin from an uncle who had died years before their marriage. The property included a structure, though the word structure was used loosely. What remained, according to the most recent assessment, was a foundation, partial walls, and what the county assessor had charitably described as a pile of bricks. There was no roof. There were no intact windows. The property had been condemned twice and cleared of its condemnation only because no one had cared enough to follow through on the paperwork. Taxes had been paid sporadically, in small amounts, just enough to prevent seizure. Martin had never visited it, at least not that anyone could confirm. He had simply held on to it the way some people held on to old keys, not because they remembered what they opened, but because throwing them away felt like giving up on something they could not name. The attorney paused, allowing the information to settle. Clara stared at the page in front of her, a legal description of a place she had never seen, owned by a man she thought she had known completely. The assessed value of the property was listed at the bottom of the page. The number was so small it seemed almost defiant, as if the land itself had decided it was not worth anyone's attention. She signed where she was told to sign. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Outside, the parking lot shimmered with heat. She sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine, the folder resting on the passenger seat like a second presence. The air conditioning struggled against the afternoon, blowing warm air that gradually cooled. She thought about calling someone, but the list of people she could call had shortened considerably in recent months. Her daughter, Elise, was in another state, working 2 jobs and raising a boy who had just turned 6. Their phone calls had become shorter, not out of lack of love, but out of exhaustion that left no room for the kind of conversation this moment required. Her sister had stopped calling after the funeral, offering silence as either a gift or a judgment. Clara could not tell which. She drove home. The apartment was small, a second-floor unit in a complex that had been built quickly and maintained reluctantly. The hallway smelled of other people's dinners. The lock stuck, as it always did, requiring a specific angle of the key that she had memorized through repetition. Inside, the rooms were clean and sparse. She had sold what she could after Martin died. Not out of grief, but out of arithmetic. The couch remained because no one wanted it. The kitchen table stayed because eating standing up felt like a concession she was not ready to make. Everything else had been weighed against its usefulness and found wanting. She placed the folder on the table and opened it again. The property description stared back at her, indifferent to the questions it raised. She read it twice, slowly, as if the second reading might reveal something the first had missed. It did not. The facts were plain. She now owned a ruin, a pile of bricks on a piece of land that no one had found worth fighting over. The phone call to Elise that evening was brief. Clara mentioned the inheritance, trying to make it sound like something rather than nothing. Elise listened with the patience of someone accustomed to managing disappointment. When Clara described the property, there was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough to hold the shape of what Elise was choosing not to say. "So it's a pile of bricks," Elise said finally, not cruelly, just clearly. Clara did not argue. She had no argument to make. What she did not expect was how quickly the news traveled through Martin's family. Within days, the calls began. Not sympathetic calls, not curious ones. These were calls that carried opinions shaped like weapons, delivered with the casual confidence of people who had always believed they understood the world better than Clara did. Martin's older brother, Gerald, called first, and his voice arrived through the phone with the same measured authority he had used at every family gathering for as long as Clara could remember. Gerald was a man who believed that proximity to money, even other people's money, entitled him to an opinion about how it should be spent. He had never been wealthy himself, but he had cultivated the bearing of someone who might be, and that performance had sustained him for decades. "I heard about the property," Gerald said, not bothering with pleasantries. "You should sell it. Whatever it's worth, take it and move on. Martin wouldn't have wanted you holding on to some crumbling pile in the middle of nowhere." Clara noted how easily Gerald spoke for a dead man. She said nothing. "I'm serious, Clara. That land has been a weight on this family for years. Uncle Dennis left it to Martin as a joke. Practically. Nobody wanted it then. Nobody wants it now. You sign it over, let the county take it, and wash your hands." She thanked him and ended the call. The advice lingered, not because it was wise, but because it carried the familiar tone of dismissal she had learned to recognize in every interaction with Martin's family. They had always spoken to her as though she were slightly behind, a half-step slow, a woman who had married above her station and should be grateful for the view. Gerald's wife, Patricia, called the next day. Her approach was softer, wrapped in concern that felt less like kindness and more like strategy. "Honey, I just want to make sure you're not getting your hopes up about that property. Gerald says it's practically worthless. The taxes alone will eat you alive. You've got enough on your plate without chasing some rundown lot that nobody cared about when Martin was alive." "I haven't decided anything yet," Clara said. "Well, don't wait too long. These things have a way of becoming problems if you let them sit." The implication was clear. Clara was not someone who should be trusted with decisions. She was someone who should be guided gently but firmly toward the conclusion that others had already reached. The property was nothing. She should treat it as nothing. Any other response would be foolish. Martin's cousin Raymond weighed in next, though his call came not to Clara directly, but through Elise, who relayed it with a weariness that suggested she had already endured several minutes of unsolicited opinion. "He says you should let the family handle it," Elise reported. He says there might be back taxes, liens, environmental issues. He says it'll cost you more than it's worth just to figure out what's there." "Did he offer to help?" "No. He offered to take it off your hands." Clara almost smiled. Almost. The consistency of the family's response had a certain clarity to it. None of them wanted her to have the property, not because they believed it was worthless, but because they could not tolerate the possibility that it might not be. If Clara held on to it and it turned out to be nothing, their judgment would be confirmed. If she held on to it and something came of it, their judgment would be exposed. Either way, her compliance was preferred. She did not comply. The decision to visit the property arrived not as a plan, but as a refusal to accept the version of events being written for her. And she had spent her life accommodating, adjusting, fitting herself into spaces defined by other people's expectations. Martin's death had stripped those expectations away, leaving behind a silence that was not empty, but open. For the first time in years, the only voice telling her what to do was her own. She drove out on a Tuesday morning. The route took her through the edges of the county, past farmland that transitioned from active to neglected in slow, visible stages. Houses grew fewer, fences leaned more. The road narrowed until it felt like a suggestion rather than a commitment, its surface cracked and patched in alternating rhythms. She followed the directions from the legal description, turning where roads intersected without signs, trusting the numbers on her odometer more than the landscape. When she found it, and she almost drove past, the property sat at the end of a dirt track that branched off the road like an afterthought. There was no mailbox, no gate, no indication that anyone had come this way in years. Weeds had reclaimed the path, growing tall enough to brush the underside of her car as she crept forward. The sound of stems scraping against metal was the only noise besides the engine. She stopped the car and sat for a moment, looking through the windshield at what Martin had left her. The description had been accurate. A foundation of gray stone and concrete rose from the earth like the skeleton of something that had once stood upright. Partial walls extended from two corners, their brick surfaces weathered and stained, mortar crumbling in lines that followed the path of decades of rain. The rest was rubble. Bricks lay in loose piles, some still bearing the remnants of their original arrangement, others scattered as if they had given up trying to hold their shape. Grass and weeds grew between them, softening the edges, making the destruction look almost intentional, like a garden designed around ruin. She stepped out of the car and the silence struck her immediately. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a place that had been left alone long enough to develop its own atmosphere. Wind moved through the grass with a sound that was almost conversational, a low, constant murmur that seemed to come from the ground itself. The sky above was wide and pale, streaked with thin clouds that offered no shade. The air smelled of dry earth, old stone, and something faintly metallic that she could not identify. She walked the perimeter slowly, her shoes crunching on gravel and loose mortar. The foundation was larger than she had expected. Whatever had stood here had not been a small structure. The footprint suggested rooms, multiple rooms, arranged around a central area that now held nothing but weeds and debris. She could see where walls had once divided the space, their outlines preserved in the stone foundation like the impression of a body in an old mattress. The bricks themselves were interesting. Not beautiful, not remarkable, but interesting in the way that old things often were when examined closely. They were a deep, uneven red, darker than modern bricks, their surfaces rough and irregular. Some bore faint markings, letters or symbols pressed into the clay before firing, too worn to read but clearly intentional. She picked one up and turned it in her hands. It was heavier than she expected, dense and solid despite its age. The weight of it felt significant, though she could not have said why. She set the brick down and continued walking. At the far end of the foundation, where the ground sloped slightly downward, she noticed that the stone base extended deeper than the surrounding terrain. What had appeared from a distance to be a simple foundation was, in fact, partially below ground level, as if the structure had been built into the earth rather than merely on top of it. The lower sections of the stone walls were darker, stained by moisture and age, but intact. She crouched and ran her fingers along the surface. It was cool to the touch, cooler than the air around it, and the mortar between the stones was different from the mortar in the upper walls. Older, harder, set with a deliberateness that spoke of care. She stood and looked back at the property from this lower vantage point. The perspective changed everything. From above, the site had looked like wreckage. From here, it looked like something that had been taken apart rather than fallen apart. The bricks were not randomly scattered. They were piled, loosely but recognizably, in groupings that suggested they had been moved rather than dropped. The pattern was subtle, invisible from a distance, but unmistakable once noticed. Someone had been here. Not recently, but not in the deep past either. Someone had disturbed the surface of this place and then left it to look as though nothing had changed. A neighbor's truck passed on the road behind her, slowing briefly before continuing on. She felt the weight of observation without acknowledgement, and the same sensation she had experienced in every room full of Martin's relatives. She was being watched, measured, and dismissed in a single glance. She returned to the car and sat with the door open, her feet resting on the ground, looking at the foundation. The attorney's words echoed in her mind. A pile of bricks. And it was that. Undeniably. But it was also something else, something she could not yet name. The property had a presence that exceeded its physical condition, a stubbornness that reminded her uncomfortably of herself. That evening, she called Elise again. "I went to see it," Clara said. "And?" "It's a pile of bricks." Elise waited. "But the foundation is solid. The ground underneath is deeper than you'd think, and the bricks have been moved. Someone's been out there at some point, going through things." "Mom?" Elise's voice carried the specific gentleness reserved for ideas that needed to be discouraged without cruelty. "It's a condemned lot. People dump things on condemned lots. Kids go out there. It doesn't mean anything." "I know what it doesn't mean. I'm telling you what I saw." The silence that followed was familiar. It was the silence of someone who loved her but did not believe her, who wanted to protect her from the hope that disappointment had not yet managed to kill. Clara understood it. She did not resent it, but she did not accept it either. Over the next several days, she returned to the property 3 more times. Each visit was longer than the last. She brought water, a folding chair, work gloves, and a notebook. She did not know what she was looking for, only that looking felt necessary. Yet the act of attention, of examining something that everyone else had dismissed, gave her a sense of purpose that she had not felt since before Martin's illness began. She began by cataloging what she could see. The foundation measured roughly 40 by 60 feet, larger than any residential structure she had lived in. The stone walls of the lower section were approximately 4 feet high at their tallest point, sunk into a depression that suggested either deliberate excavation or natural settling. The upper walls, where they existed, were brick, rising an additional 3 to 5 feet before ending abruptly in jagged lines where demolition or collapse had interrupted their progress. The mortar in the stone sections was dense and gray, almost cement-like. The mortar in the brick sections was lighter, sandier, and had deteriorated more visibly. She noted the bricks with markings. There were more of them than she had initially realized. Most bore a single letter or symbol, stamped into the clay at a consistent depth and angle. The repetition suggested manufacturing rather than artistry, a maker's mark or a batch identifier. She photographed several of them, holding her phone close to the surface to capture the worn impressions. On her third visit, she brought a small shovel. Not to dig, not yet, but because the ground around the lower foundation had begun to interest her. Rain had fallen the night before, and the soil had softened, pulling away from the stone in places where it had been packed tightly. Near the base of the deepest wall, she noticed a gap, narrow but distinct, running horizontally along the junction of stone and earth. It was not a crack caused by settling. It was a seam, the kind that formed where two surfaces met without bonding. She pressed her finger into it and felt air, faint but unmistakable, rising from below. Her heart quickened. She told herself it was nothing. Foundations had gaps. Water found paths. Air moved through soil. Every explanation was rational and available. She accepted none of them. She began to clear the area around the seam, using her hands first, then the shovel. The soil came away in heavy, damp layers, revealing more of the stone wall beneath. As she worked downward, the wall continued, extending further into the ground than the visible foundation suggested. At roughly 3 feet below the current ground level, the texture of the stone changed. The blocks became larger, more uniform, and set with a precision that contrasted sharply with the rougher construction above. The mortar here was darker, almost black, and had held with remarkable tenacity. Whatever this lower section was, it had been built to last in a way the upper structure had not. She stopped digging when the light began to fail. Standing at the edge of the shallow trench she had created, she looked down at the exposed wall and felt something shift inside her. This was not a pile of bricks. This was a surface. Beneath the surface, there was depth, and beneath the depth, there was intention. Gerald called again that week. This time his tone carried less authority and more exasperation, as though Clara's refusal to follow instructions was a personal affront. "I heard you've been going out to that property," he said. "Clara, people are talking. They think you've lost perspective. Martin's barely cold and you're out there digging in the dirt like you're going to find buried treasure." "I'm looking at what Martin left me." "He left you a liability. That's what he left you. I told him years ago to dump that land, but he wouldn't listen. Stubborn. Just like you. Maybe that's why he married me." The silence on the other end was satisfying in a way she did not allow herself to enjoy for long. "Clara, I'm saying this as family. Walk away. The property isn't worth the gas it takes to get there. You've got real problems. Bills, rent, Elise, and the boy. Focus on what matters." She thanked him and hung up. His words settled around her like dust, fine and irritating, impossible to ignore completely. He was not entirely wrong. The bills were real. The rent was due. Elise's life in another state was a constant source of quiet worry. The practical reality of Clara's situation did not allow for sentimentality or speculation. Every hour spent at the property was an hour not spent looking for work, not spent reducing the stack of envelopes on her kitchen counter. And yet, the seam in the stone, the air rising from below, the bricks that had been moved, the foundation that went deeper than it should have, each detail accumulated like evidence in a case she had not yet named. She was not foolish. She knew the difference between hope and delusion, but she also knew the difference between something dismissed because it was worthless and something dismissed because no one had bothered to look. She looked. The following week she returned with better tools, a proper shovel, a hand trowel, a pry bar, a flashlight. She had spent 2 evenings at the library, reading about foundations, stone construction, and the history of the county. What she had found was fragmentary but suggestive. The eastern part of the county had been home to several estates in the late 19th century, properties built by families who had made their fortunes in industry, mining, and trade. Most of those estates had been dismantled or abandoned during the economic collapses of the early 20th century. A few had been repurposed. Others had simply vanished, their materials salvaged, their land absorbed into the agricultural grid that now defined the landscape. Martin's uncle Dennis, she learned, had acquired the property decades ago under circumstances the records did not fully explain. The deed showed a transfer from an estate, not a sale, which suggested inheritance or legal settlement rather than a commercial transaction. Dennis had never built on the land. He had never filed for permits or improvements. He had simply held it, paying the minimum required to keep it from being claimed, as though he were waiting for something he never explained. Clara thought about Dennis, whom she had never met. She thought about Martin, who had inherited the property and done the same thing. Two men across generations holding on to a piece of land that produced nothing, cost something, and appeared to offer nothing in return. The stubbornness was remarkable. It was also informative. People did not hold on to worthless things for decades unless they believed, however quietly, that the things were not worthless. She began her work at the seam she had found, and the pry bar fit neatly into the gap between stone and earth, and she used it to widen the opening incrementally. The soil resisted, then yielded, falling away in chunks that revealed more of the lower wall. As the gap widened, the air from below grew more noticeable, a steady, cool current that carried the scent of enclosed space, dry stone, and old dust. After an hour of careful work, she had exposed a section of the lower wall roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep. The stone blocks here were large, each one weighing more than she could lift, set with a precision that required skill and intention. The mortar between them was intact, showing no signs of deterioration. Whatever lay behind this wall had been sealed with the expectation that it would endure. At the bottom of her trench, where the wall met what she assumed would be solid ground, she found something different, a stone that was not set like the others. Its edges were more defined, its surface smoother, and it sat slightly recessed from the surrounding blocks, as though it had been placed after the wall was built, filling a space that had once been open. She ran her fingers along its perimeter and felt the familiar breath of air, stronger here, more insistent. She stopped, sat back on her heels, looked at the sky, which was beginning to soften toward evening. The field around her was empty, silent, except for the wind and the distant sound of a tractor on a road she could not see. She was alone with a wall that went deeper than anyone knew, a stone that did not belong, and a current of air that rose from somewhere beneath the earth like a whisper she could not yet translate. Everything she had been told about this property, by the attorney, by Gerald, by Patricia, by the indifferent numbers on the assessment form, all of it assumed that what was visible was all there was. Clara had spent her life being told that what was visible was all there was, that her quiet manner meant she had nothing to say, that her modest circumstances meant she had nothing to offer, that her husband's family's judgment was the final word on her value. She had accepted those assessments for years, not because she believed them, but because challenging them had never seemed worth the cost. Now, kneeling in the dirt beside a foundation that everyone had told her to abandon, she felt something shift. Not hope, not yet, as something older and more durable. Resolve. The same resolve that had carried her through 22 years of marriage, through illness and loss, through the paperwork and the silence and the slow erosion of everything she had built. She would come back tomorrow. She would bring better tools. She would move the stone that did not belong and find out what lay beneath it. And if there was nothing there, she would know that she had looked. That, at least, would be hers. She drove home as the last light drained from the sky, the folder from the attorney's office still resting on the passenger seat, its contents unchanged, but its meaning already shifting. The apartment waited for her, small and quiet and temporary. The bills waited on the counter. And the empty chair at the kitchen table waited with the patience of things that did not care whether they were occupied. But beneath the foundation, something else waited too. And unlike everything else in Clara's life, it had been waiting for a very long time. She did not tell anyone what she had found. Not Elise, not Gerald, not the neighbors who had begun to notice her regular trips down the county road. The decision was not strategic. It was instinctive, the same instinct that had kept her silent during years of family dinners where opinions were offered like verdicts and disagreement was treated as ingratitude. She had learned that sharing information before she understood it gave others the power to define it. And she was not ready to let anyone define what that stone, that seam, that breath of air rising from the earth might mean. The next morning, she packed the car with purpose. Tools she had purchased from a hardware store 2 towns over where no one knew her name. Water, food, a blanket in case the work lasted longer than the light. She wore clothes she did not mind ruining, boots that gripped the earth, gloves that protected her hands without sacrificing feeling. She had spent the night preparing, not just physically but mentally, arranging her thoughts the way she had arranged the tools, each one placed where it would be needed. The drive felt shorter this time, the route already memorized by her body if not her mind. When she arrived, the property greeted her with its familiar stillness. The bricks lay where they had always lain. The foundation rose from the earth with the patience of something that had stopped caring about time. And the trench she had dug was undisturbed, the exposed stone wall waiting exactly as she had left it. She climbed down into the trench and knelt beside the recessed stone. In the morning light, its difference from the surrounding blocks was even more apparent. The edges were cleaner, the surface bore fewer marks of age, and the mortar around its perimeter was a shade lighter than the rest. It had been placed later, she was now certain. Not by the original builders, but by someone who had come afterward, someone who had known what lay behind the wall and had chosen to seal it rather than reveal it. She positioned the pry bar at the edge of the stone and applied pressure. The resistance was immediate and substantial. The stone was heavy and the mortar, though different, had set firmly. She adjusted her angle and tried again, but working the tip of the bar deeper into the gap. Small fragments of mortar broke free, falling into the trench with soft clicks. The air from behind the stone grew more perceptible with each piece that fell away, its cool, dry character unchanged. She worked for nearly an hour before the stone shifted. The movement was small, barely a centimeter, but it was enough to change the sound the pry bar made against the surface. What had been a solid, unyielding resistance became something with give, a heaviness that could be persuaded rather than a permanence that could not. She repositioned herself, bracing her feet against the opposite wall of the trench, and pushed the bar with both hands. The stone moved again. This time, the gap around its edges widened enough for her to see darkness behind it, not the shallow darkness of packed earth, but the deeper darkness of open space. The air that emerged was stronger now, a steady exhalation that carried the scent of age itself, dry and mineral and untouched by the world above. She stopped. Her arms trembled from the effort, her breathing heavy, sweat gathering at her temples despite the cool morning air. She leaned close to the gap and listened. The silence that came from behind the stone was different from the silence of the field. It was enclosed, contained, the silence of a space that had been sealed and left alone. She reached for the flashlight and angled it into the gap. The beam disappeared into the darkness beyond, illuminating nothing but dust motes suspended in the escaping air. The space behind the stone was larger than the gap allowed her to see, extending in directions the light could not reach. Clara sat back and stared at the stone. Her heart was beating harder than the physical effort warranted. She was not afraid. She was certain of that. What she felt was something more complex, a mixture of anticipation and reverence that she had never experienced before. She was standing at the edge of something that had been hidden deliberately, and whatever reason had existed for hiding it had not been enough to destroy it. Someone had chosen preservation over elimination. That choice, separated from her by decades, felt like an outstretched hand. She returned to the pry bar. The stone resisted again, but now she understood its weight and how it sat in its frame. She worked the bar along the perimeter, loosening the remaining mortar, creating gaps at each edge until the stone was held in place by friction and gravity alone. And then she positioned herself carefully, placed her hands on the stone's surface, and pushed. It fell inward. The sound it made was enormous in the quiet field, a deep, heavy impact that resonated through the ground beneath her knees. Dust erupted from the opening, a cloud that rolled over her and dissipated into the morning air, carrying with it the concentrated scent of decades of enclosure. She coughed, turned her face away, and waited for the air to clear. When she looked back, the opening was there, rectangular, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, framed by the heavy stones of the original wall. Beyond it, darkness waited with the patience of something that had been expecting her, even if she had not been expecting it. She reached for the flashlight and held it at the edge of the opening, angling the beam downward. What she saw made her breath catch and hold, suspended in her chest, like a word she could not yet speak. Stone steps, leading down, cut into the earth with the same precision as the wall itself, each one level and smooth, descending into a space that the flashlight could not fully illuminate from this angle. The steps were clean, remarkably so, protected from the elements by the seal that had kept the air inside dry and still. Along the walls of the stairway, she could see the same large stone blocks, set with the same dark mortar, forming a passage that was narrow but deliberate. This was not a natural formation. This was not an accident of construction. This was a stairway, built with intention, it leading to something that the builders had considered important enough to construct beneath the earth and someone else had considered important enough to seal behind stone. Clara lowered the flashlight and sat back, her legs folded beneath her, her hands resting on the earth at the edge of the opening. The sun was climbing higher, warming her back, casting her shadow into the passage below. She could hear her own breathing, steady now, slower than it had been. The field around her remained still. The bricks lay in their piles. The partial walls stood as they always had. But beneath them, something waited. Something that had been waiting since before she was born, since before Martin, since before any of the voices that had told her this place was worthless. She would go down. She knew that. Not recklessly, not immediately, but with the same careful determination that had brought her here. She would see what lay at the bottom of those steps. She would find out what someone had built beneath this foundation and what someone else had tried to hide. But first, she sat in the sun and let the moment settle into her bones. For the first time since Martin's death, possibly for the first time in years, she felt that the ground beneath her held something more than obligation and loss. It held possibility. And possibility, she was learning, was not given to those who waited. It was claimed by those who were willing to look where no one else had bothered. The opening breathed its cool, patient air into the morning, and Clara breathed with it, readying herself for whatever lay below. She did not descend that day. The decision was not born of fear, though fear would have been reasonable. It was born of the same caution that had guided her through every difficult passage of her life. Rushing into unknown spaces, physical or otherwise, was how people lost their footing. She had learned that lesson not from books, but from decades of navigating a world that punished women who moved too quickly and dismissed women who moved too slowly. The margin between those two penalties was narrow, and she had spent her life finding it. Instead, she secured the opening. She placed boards across it, weighted them with bricks from the nearest pile, and covered the entire arrangement with a section of tarp she had brought in the car. From a distance, the site looked as it always had, a neglected foundation surrounded by weeds and rubble. No one passing on the road would see anything different. And that anonymity felt essential, though she could not yet articulate why. On the drive home, her mind worked in circles. The stairway existed. That was no longer a question. What waited at the bottom was still unknown, but the existence of the passage itself changed everything she understood about the property. This was not a simple foundation. It was the surface of something deeper, something that had been built with resources and skill that far exceeded what the visible remains suggested. She thought about Martin again. Had he known? The question gnawed at her from multiple angles. He had held the property for years, paying taxes on a ruin, never visiting, never selling. That behavior suggested either profound indifference or deliberate patience. Martin had not been an indifferent man. He had been quiet, yes, and private in ways that sometimes felt like walls. But indifference was not in his nature. If he had held on to the property, he had done so for a reason. And if that reason was connected to what lay beneath the foundation, then his silence during their marriage took on a different character entirely. The thought hurt more than she expected, not because it suggested deception, but because it suggested a burden carried alone. Martin had been a man who bore weight without complaint, who fixed things with his hands because asking for help felt like an admission of inadequacy. If he had known about the passage, about whatever waited below, he might have kept it to himself not out of mistrust, but out of the same stubborn protectiveness that had defined everything he did. He would have wanted to understand it first, to make sure it was safe, and to spare Clara the uncertainty. He would have waited until he was sure, and then he had gotten sick, and the waiting had become permanent. She pulled into the apartment complex parking lot and sat in the car, engine off, hands still on the wheel. The evening light was soft, the kind that made even worn buildings look temporary, as though they might dissolve if you looked away long enough. She watched a child ride a bicycle across the lot, weaving between parked cars with the reckless confidence of someone who had not yet learned that the world could hurt. The sight made her chest ache with a tenderness she had not invited. She went inside, ate, standing at the counter, and spread her notes across the kitchen table. She drew the foundation from memory, marking the location of the opening, the orientation of the steps, or the direction they descended. Based on her rough measurements, the stairway led inward and downward toward the center of the original structure. If it continued at the angle she had observed, it would reach a depth of 8 to 10 feet below the current ground level within a relatively short distance. Whatever space existed at the bottom would be fully underground, insulated by earth and stone on all sides. She made a list of what she would need: a stronger flashlight, preferably a headlamp that would leave both hands free; rope, in case the steps were unstable or the passage narrowed; a phone, fully charged, with the location shared to Elise in a message she would send before descending. Practical things, things that a woman alone at a remote property should have when entering an unknown space beneath the earth. The list was not long, but writing it made the next step feel real in a way that thinking about it had not. She called Elise that night, not to explain what she had found, but to hear her daughter's voice. The conversation moved through the usual channels. The boy was growing fast, the job was demanding, money was tight but manageable. Neither of them mentioned the property. When they hung up, Clara sat in the silence of the apartment and felt the distance between their lives as a physical presence, like a wall she could not see through but could always feel. The next morning, she bought what she needed. The hardware store clerk did not ask questions, though his eyes lingered on the combination of rope, headlamp, and heavy-duty gloves with mild curiosity. She paid in cash, loaded the car, and drove. The property waited. It always waited. And that was one of the things she had come to understand about it. Unlike everything else in her life, the foundation did not demand, did not judge, did not hurry. It simply existed, offering itself to whoever was willing to pay attention. The patience of the place felt earned, as though it had learned long ago that the right person would come eventually. She removed the tarp and boards, checked the opening, and peered inside. The stairway was unchanged, its steps clean and steady, descending into darkness that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. The cool air rose from below with the same steady breath she had felt before, carrying its ancient scent of stone and stillness. She fitted the headlamp to her forehead, checked the rope, and lowered herself into the opening. And her boots found the first step with a solidity that surprised her. The stone was firm, dry, and perfectly level. She shifted her weight forward and descended. Each step took her deeper into the earth and further from the world above. The walls of the passage closed in slightly as she went, but not uncomfortably. The space was narrow, perhaps 3 feet wide, but the ceiling remained high enough that she did not need to duck. The headlamp cast a steady cone of light ahead, illuminating stone walls that glistened faintly with mineral deposits, but showed no signs of water damage or structural failure. The air grew cooler with each step, but remained dry, a testament to the quality of the construction that had kept moisture out for what she now estimated to be well over a century. She counted the steps as she descended. 7, 8, 9. At 12, the stairway leveled into a short landing, and the passage turned to the right. She paused there, one hand against the wall, and listened. The silence was complete. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of containment, of a space so thoroughly sealed that even sound had been preserved in its original stillness. She turned the corner, and the headlamp found a door. It was wooden, heavy, bound with iron straps that had darkened with age, but remained intact. The surface was smooth, worn by what she imagined had been the passage of hands over decades. A handle, also iron, protruded from the right side, shaped for gripping, practical rather than decorative. There was no lock. The door was held shut by its own weight and the precision of its frame. I set into the stone with the same care that characterized everything else she had encountered. Clara stood before it, her breath steady, her hands at her sides. The headlamp illuminated the door's surface in sharp detail, revealing the grain of the wood, the texture of the iron, the faint line where the door met the frame. Behind it, something waited. Something that had been placed there deliberately, sealed away from light and air and time, preserved by the same intention that had built the stairway and the walls and the foundation that everyone had called a pile of bricks. She reached for the handle. The iron was cold against her palm, colder than the air around it, as though it drew temperature from the earth itself. She gripped it firmly and pulled. The door moved, slowly, heavily, with a sound like a long-held breath finally released. Dust fell from the frame in thin streams, catching the light of the headlamp like suspended gold. The air that escaped from behind the door was different from the air in the passage. It was denser, older, carrying a scent that she could not name but recognized instinctively as the smell of something that had been kept rather than forgotten. The door opened fully, and Clara stepped through, and what the headlamp revealed in that underground chamber made her knees weaken and her hand find the wall for support. Not from fear, from the sheer, overwhelming weight of what she was seeing. The chamber was large, far larger than the passage had suggested. Its ceiling arched overhead, supported by stone columns that rose from a floor laid with flagstones worn smooth by age. And lining the walls, stacked on shelves carved into the stone itself, arranged with a precision that spoke of cataloging rather than storage, were objects that gleamed in the light with the unmistakable warmth of gold. Clara stood in the doorway of a vault that should not have existed, beneath a foundation everyone had told her was worthless, on land that a dead man had held in silence for reasons she was only now beginning to understand. Her legs trembled, her eyes burned. The headlamp swept across the chamber, catching reflections that multiplied in the darkness, each one confirming what the first had promised. This was not a single object. This was a collection, a fortune, a secret kept beneath brick and stone and silence for longer than anyone alive could remember. She lowered herself to the floor of the chamber, her back against the doorframe, and pressed her hands to her face. The coolness of the stone seeped through her clothing, grounding her in the physical reality of where she was. She was underground. She was alone. And she was sitting at the threshold of something that would change everything. The tears came without warning, not tears of joy, though joy was part of it. Not tears of grief, though grief was there too. They were the tears of a woman who had been told by every voice she had ever trusted that what she had was not enough, that what she saw was not real, that what she believed was not worth believing. And now, in the silence of a chamber no one knew existed, the evidence of her own persistence surrounded her in gold and shadow. She sat there for a long time, breathing, letting the moment expand until it filled every empty space the world had carved inside her. Then she stood, wiped her eyes, and then began to look. The chamber revealed itself in stages, each sweep of the headlamp uncovering details that deepened the scope of what she was standing inside. Clara moved slowly, her boots barely lifting from the flagstone floor, her arms close to her body as though the space demanded a physical restraint she was not fully conscious of giving. The air was still, perfectly still, and the temperature held steady at a coolness that felt less like cold and more like preservation. Nothing in this room had moved in a very long time. The dust on the floor recorded only her own footprints, stretching behind her in a line that connected the doorway to wherever she chose to go next. The shelves were the first thing she examined closely. They were not freestanding. They had been carved directly into the stone walls, on each one a shallow ledge, cut with a uniformity that required tools and time. There were 4 levels of shelving on each wall, running nearly the full length of the chamber, and every shelf held objects arranged with the deliberate spacing of someone who understood that what they were storing deserved order. The gold was not what she had imagined gold would look like, not the bright, polished yellow of jewelry store windows. This gold was deeper, richer, carrying the weight of its color in a way that suggested density rather than decoration. Bars. She counted them first because they were the most immediately recognizable. They sat in rows along the lowest shelves, rectangular and uniform, each one roughly the size of a standard brick, but heavier, far heavier than anything that size had a right to be. As she crouched beside the nearest row and touched one with the tip of her finger, the surface was smooth, cool, and carried a faint impression stamped into its face, characters she could not read in the dim light, numbers and letters arranged in an official configuration that spoke of origin and weight. She did not try to lift one. Not yet. The impulse was there, the desire to confirm with her body what her eyes were telling her. But something held her back. The same instinct that had kept her from rushing down the stairs. These objects had waited decades in silence. They could wait a few minutes more while she tried to understand the full shape of what surrounded her. She straightened and moved along the wall, the headlamp tracking across the shelves at eye level. Above the gold bars, the second tier held smaller objects. Coins. And she realized, stacked in columns and secured in cloth rolls that had darkened with age, but retained their shape. The rolls were arranged by size, and where the cloth had parted at the edges, she could see the glint of metal beneath, some gold, some silver, some a darker alloy she did not recognize. The variety suggested collection rather than currency, objects gathered from different sources over a significant period of time. The third tier held boxes, wooden, metal, a few wrapped in oilcloth that had stiffened into something resembling leather. She did not open them. Their presence was enough for now, their arranged precision telling her that whoever had placed them here had known exactly what each one contained and had organized them accordingly. Small labels, handwritten on paper that had yellowed to the color of old cream. They were affixed to several of the boxes. The handwriting was neat and angular, the kind of penmanship that belonged to an era when legibility was considered a measure of character. She moved deeper into the chamber. The far wall held something different. Instead of shelves, it featured a series of recessed alcoves, each one large enough to hold a single object. Inside these alcoves, Clara found items that made her pause longer than anything else she had encountered. Paintings, small ones, framed in wood and metal, their surfaces dark with age but intact. She could see figures, landscapes, scenes rendered with a skill that even her untrained eye recognized as significant. The frames alone appeared to be works of craftsmanship, their corners fitted and carved with attention that suggested value beyond their function. Beside the paintings, and in deeper alcoves, stood objects she could not immediately identify. Figurines made of materials that ranged from porcelain to what appeared to be jade. A clock, its face dark, its hands frozen at an hour that had lost its meaning. Leather-bound books, their spines cracked but intact, titles pressed in gold leaf that still caught the light. A set of what looked like navigational instruments, brass and glass, arranged in a fitted case lined with velvet that had faded from red to a dusty rose. The chamber was not merely a vault. It was an archive, a repository of wealth that had been accumulated, curated, and preserved with the same intention that had built the walls around it. This was not a hasty hiding place, not a hole dug in panic and filled with whatever was at hand. This was the work of someone who had planned carefully, who had understood the value of what they possessed, and who had chosen to protect it beneath the earth rather than trust it to the uncertainties above. Clara completed her circuit of the room and returned to the doorway. She leaned against the frame and looked back at the chamber as a whole. The headlamp caught the surfaces of gold and brass and glass, scattering light in patterns that moved with her breathing. The total volume of what she was seeing was difficult to comprehend. Not because any single object was beyond understanding, but because the accumulation of them, shelf after shelf, alcove after alcove, created a sum that her mind could not yet calculate. She was not a woman who had ever dealt in large numbers. Her life had been measured in rent payments and grocery totals, and in the precise arithmetic of how much was left after what was owed had been subtracted. The language of wealth, real wealth, the kind that filled rooms and required vaults, was as foreign to her as the handwriting on the labels. She recognized its presence without being able to name its dimensions. She stayed in the chamber for nearly 2 hours, moving from section to section, photographing what she could, making notes in the small notebook she had brought. She did not touch more than she needed to. The restraint was partly practical. She did not want to disturb anything before she understood its significance, and partly emotional. Touching the objects would make them hers in a way that seeing them alone did not, and she was not yet ready for the full weight of that ownership. When she finally climbed back up the stairs and emerged into the daylight, the contrast was almost violent. The sun had climbed high during her time underground, and the field around the foundation blazed with a brightness that made her squint and raise her hand to shield her eyes. The world above was unchanged. The bricks lay in their piles. The partial walls stood as they had stood for decades. The road was empty. The silence of the field continued as though nothing had happened. She sat in her car with the door open and drank water until the bottle was empty. Her hands shook, not with cold, not with fear, but with the effort of containing something too large for the body she carried it in. She looked at the photographs on her phone, scrolling through them slowly, confirming that what she had seen was real and recorded. Each image carried the same amber glow of the headlamp, the same shadows, the same shapes that had no business existing beneath a condemned foundation in the poorest corner of the county. She drove home in silence. The radio stayed off. The windows stayed up. The folder from the attorney's office still sat on the passenger seat, and she placed her phone on top of it, the photographs now layered over the legal description like an answer placed atop a question. That night, she did not sleep so much as rest in a state of sustained alertness. Her body lay still, but her mind moved through the chamber again and again, cataloging, measuring, trying to assign scale to what she had seen. The gold bars alone, if they were genuine, represented a value she could not calculate without help. The coins, the paintings, the objects in the alcoves, and each category added layers of complexity that pushed the total further from anything she had ever conceived of possessing. She understood, with a clarity that settled over her like a second skin, that she could not do this alone. The discovery was too large, too significant, too fraught with implications to be managed by a single woman with no expertise in precious metals, antiques, or the legal architecture required to claim and protect such a find. She needed help. The question was from whom? The thought of calling Gerald made her almost laugh. The sound that escaped was not quite humor. It was closer to exhaustion laced with irony. The man who had told her to walk away from a pile of bricks, who had spoken for a dead brother with the confidence of someone who had never listened to him while he was alive, and would now need to be told that beneath those bricks lay something that dwarfed every assumption he had ever made. The thought was satisfying and terrifying in equal measure. She did not call Gerald. She did not call anyone in Martin's family. Not yet. The information was too raw, too vulnerable. Sharing it before she had it verified, authenticated, and legally secured would be an act of trust she could not afford. She had seen how quickly those voices mobilized to tell her what to think. She would not give them the opportunity to tell her what to do with something they had dismissed before she found it. Instead, she made a different call. The attorney who had handled Martin's estate was a careful man, not brilliant, not particularly warm, but thorough in a way that inspired confidence. When Clara asked him, in measured terms, say whether he could recommend someone who dealt with the appraisal of valuable property, specifically items of historical and material significance, the pause on the other end was telling. "Can you be more specific about what you've found?" he asked. "Not on the phone," Clara said. "But I need someone who can tell me what something is worth and who can be trusted to do it quietly." Another pause, then a name. A firm that operated out of the state capital, specializing in estate valuations, rare assets, and historical artifacts. They had handled cases involving recovered collections, disputed inheritances, and discoveries that required discretion before they required publicity. The attorney offered to make an introduction if Clara wished. She wished. 3 days later, a man named Arthur Calloway arrived at Clara's apartment in a sedan that was clean but not conspicuous. He was older than she expected, tall and thin, with hands that moved with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to handling things that could not be replaced. He wore a jacket despite the warmth, and when he shook her hand, his grip was firm but brief, the greeting of a professional who understood that trust was earned by competence, not charm. She had told him very little over the phone, only that she had inherited a property, that the property contained a subterranean space, and that the space held items she believed to be of significant value. Calloway had listened without interruption and had asked only 2 questions. Was the space structurally safe, and had she removed anything from it? And she answered yes to the first and no to the second. He agreed to come. They drove to the property together, Clara leading the way in her car, Calloway following at a respectful distance. When they arrived, she watched his face as he took in the sight. The bricks, the partial walls, the weeds, the foundation that looked like nothing worth a second glance. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes moved with the same careful attention she had seen in his hands. He was reading the landscape the way she had learned to read it, looking for what was beneath the obvious. She led him to the trench, then to the opening, then down the stairs. He descended without comment, his own flashlight sweeping the walls with practiced efficiency. When they reached the door and she pushed it open, the chamber greeted them with its familiar stillness and the faint gleam of reflected light. Calloway stepped inside and stopped. She watched his back, the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the way his hand reached for the wall. He did not speak for a long time. The headlamp and flashlight together illuminated the chamber more fully than her solo visits had managed, and in that combined light, the scope of the collection was even more apparent. Gold-catching light from two sources seemed to multiply, filling the room with a warmth that was almost alive. "When did you find this?" he asked finally. His voice was quiet, but not from awe, from caution. The caution of a man who understood that what he was looking at carried consequences. 11 days ago, Clara said. He nodded slowly, as though the number mattered, and then began to move through the chamber. She watched him work. His approach was methodical in a way that made her own careful exploration seem hasty by comparison. He examined the shelves first, not touching the objects, but leaning close, studying surfaces, reading labels, noting the arrangement. He produced a small notebook from his jacket and wrote steadily as he moved, his handwriting tight and efficient. At the gold bars, he paused longest. He put on gloves, thin ones, the kind that seemed designed to protect the objects rather than the hands, and lifted one bar from the shelf. The effort required was visible in his forearms, a controlled tension that confirmed the weight she had imagined. He turned the bar slowly, examining every surface, then set it down precisely where it had been. "These are hallmarked," he said, more to himself than to her. "Multiple mints. Some I recognize. Others will require research." He moved to the coins, lifting a cloth roll and unraveling it with the care of someone opening a letter from the dead. The coins inside caught the light, their edges sharp despite their age. He held one between his fingers and turned it slowly. "Numismatic value on top of bullion," he murmured. "Some of these are considerably old." The paintings received a different kind of attention. He stood before each one without moving, studying the surface from various angles, noting brushwork, composition, the condition of the frame. At one painting, a small landscape, he leaned close enough that his breath might have touched the surface, then stepped back with an expression she could not read. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Clara shook her head. He did not elaborate. He wrote something in his notebook, underlined it, and moved on. The process took nearly 4 hours. By the time Calloway straightened and faced her, Clara's legs ached from standing on the stone floor, and the battery in her headlamp had dimmed to a softer glow. The chamber felt different now, not because it had changed, but because it had been witnessed by someone who understood its language. "I cannot give you a figure today," Calloway said. His voice was careful, each word placed like a stone in mortar. "What I can tell you is that this collection is significant. The gold alone represents substantial value, but the numismatic pieces, the artwork, and the historical items may exceed the metals by a considerable margin. Some of what I have seen in this room will require specialists that I will need to bring in. Conservators, art historians, metallurgists. This is not a weekend project, Mrs. Voss." "Clara," she said. "Clara." He paused, and something in his expression softened just slightly, just enough to suggest that he was not immune to the human weight of what he had witnessed. "I have been doing this work for 31 years. I have appraised estates, collections, and discoveries across this state and beyond. What you have shown me today is among the most remarkable finds I have encountered, not only for its value, but for its condition. Whoever built this chamber understood preservation at a level that rivals modern methods. The temperature stability, the moisture control, the sealing technique. These items have been kept in conditions that museums would envy. Clara absorbed his words without responding immediately. She had expected confirmation, but the gravity of it, the specificity, still struck her with a force she had not prepared for. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now, with your permission, I assemble a team, discreetly. The appraisal process will take weeks, possibly longer, depending on what the specialists determine about individual pieces. I will need to photograph everything in detail, take samples where appropriate, and conduct provenance research on the items that appear to have historical significance. Simultaneously, I would strongly recommend that you engage a legal team experienced in asset recovery, inheritance law, and tax implications. The value we are discussing will attract attention once it becomes known, and you will want to be fully protected before that happens." Clara nodded. The practical language grounded her. Steps, processes, protections, these were things she could manage, even if the scale was beyond anything she had previously imagined. "Can you give me a range?" she asked. "Even a rough one. I need to know what I'm dealing with." Calloway hesitated. She could see the professional resistance to speculation warring with an understanding that she deserved some framework for what lay ahead. "Based on what I have observed today, and this is a preliminary assessment only, the gold bullion in this chamber, if authenticated, represents a value in the range of $100 to $150 million. The numismatic collection could add another 30 to 60 million, depending on rarity and condition. The artwork and historical items are the most variable. A single painting in this collection, if it is what I believe it may be, I could be worth more than the gold combined. I am not prepared to speculate on the total until the full appraisal is complete, but I would not be surprised if it exceeds $300 million. The number entered the room like a physical object, taking up space, displacing air. Clara heard it, processed it, and felt nothing. Not joy, not relief, not triumph. The number was too large to correspond to any emotion she had practiced feeling. It existed in a category beyond her experience, like a measurement of distance to a star. Meaningful in theory, abstract in practice. She would feel it later, she knew, when the abstraction gave way to reality, when $300 million stopped being a number and started being a life. "I understand," she said. They climbed back up in silence. The daylight felt like a different country. The Calloway stood at the edge of the foundation, looking at the piles of bricks and the partial walls with an expression that might have been respect or might have been disbelief that the world above could so thoroughly contradict the world below. "This property was assessed at how much?" he asked. "Less than the car I drove here in," Clara said. He shook his head slowly. "Extraordinary." The weeks that followed moved at a pace Clara had not experienced since Martin's illness. But where that period had been defined by contraction, by the steady shrinking of possibilities and options, this was expansion. Each day brought new information, new people, new dimensions to a discovery that seemed to grow larger the more closely it was examined. Calloway's team arrived in stages, a conservator from a university 3 states away, and a woman whose hands moved over the paintings with a tenderness that Clara found unexpectedly moving. A metallurgist who spent 2 full days in the chamber, testing samples, measuring weights, running analyses with portable equipment that hummed and clicked in the underground silence. A numismatist, a quiet man with thick glasses and a gentle voice, who examined each coin with an intensity that suggested he was holding conversations with the dead. Each specialist brought a piece of the picture into focus. The gold bars, they confirmed, were genuine. Multiple mints, multiple eras, multiple nations of origin. The hallmarks told stories of trade routes, financial institutions, and periods of accumulation that spanned the better part of a century. The weight, calculated and confirmed against the markings, and aligned with the preliminary estimate Callaway had given. If anything, it was conservative. The coins told a richer story. Among the cloth rolls and small boxes, the numismatist found pieces that made him sit down, remove his glasses, and stare at the wall for several minutes before resuming his work. Gold eagles and double eagles from the early American mint. British sovereigns bearing the profiles of monarchs who had ruled when the collection was still being assembled. South African Krugerrands from the earliest years of their production, and among them, scattered like whispers in a conversation of shouts, coins of such rarity that the numismatist could only describe them in terms of how many others existed in the world. Some he believed to be unique. The artwork required the most delicate assessment. But the conservator spent days examining each painting, first visually, then with instruments that measured paint layers, canvas age, and chemical composition. Her findings were delivered in a clinical language that Clara was learning to translate. Attribution pending. Consistent with period. Provenance research required. But behind the professional restraint, Clara could see the conservator's excitement, the barely contained energy of someone who had found something worth dedicating years to studying. One painting in particular drew extended attention. The small landscape Callaway had noticed on their first visit together. The conservator examined it for an entire day, photographing it from dozens of angles, comparing it to images on her laptop, consulting with colleagues by phone in conversations conducted in hushed, urgent tones. When she finally spoke to Clara about it, her voice carried a quality that Clara recognized immediately. It was the voice of someone trying very hard not to say something too large too quickly. "I cannot confirm attribution without further analysis," the conservator said. "But the brushwork, the composition, the materials used, they are consistent with a body of work that has been missing from the art world for over 100 years. If this painting is what preliminary evidence suggests, it would be among the most significant recoveries in the history of American art conservation." Clara listened. She did not ask for a number. The numbers had already grown beyond her ability to react to them individually. Each new figure added to a sum that had crossed the threshold of personal meaning and entered the territory of something else entirely. This was no longer about her bills, her rent, her daughter's struggles. This was about a discovery that would ripple outward into worlds she had never occupied, affecting markets, institutions, and histories she had never studied. The legal team arrived next. 2 attorneys, one specializing in asset recovery and one in tax law, both recommended by Callaway. They were thorough, serious people who spoke in paragraphs rather than sentences, and who understood that Clara's position, while extraordinary, was also vulnerable. The discovery needed to be declared, cataloged, and protected through a framework of legal instruments that would ensure Clara's ownership while satisfying the obligations that sudden wealth invariably created. The conversations with the attorneys were the first time Clara felt the reality of her situation press against her in a way that was not purely emotional. Tax implications, reporting requirements, insurance, security, provenance disputes that might arise if any of the items were linked to stolen or contested property. The attorneys spoke of these things with the calm competence of people who had seen wealth arrive suddenly before and who knew that its arrival always brought complications. Clara sat through each meeting with the same posture she had maintained in the attorney's office months ago, straight-backed, hands folded, face composed. The difference was that now she was not absorbing news of loss. She was absorbing news of gain, and the effort required to remain steady in the face of both, she discovered, was remarkably similar. A word began to escape, not through any breach of the team's discretion, but through the simple physics of activity. Vehicles arrived at the property daily now. Equipment was carried in and out. The tarp over the opening was replaced by a more substantial temporary structure. The road that had been empty for years now bore tire tracks that anyone paying attention could follow. The neighbor who had slowed her truck on Clara's first visit slowed again, then stopped. She approached Clara one afternoon while the team was underground, her expression a careful mixture of friendliness and curiosity. "Lot of activity out here lately," the woman observed. Her tone was conversational, but her eyes were direct. "There is," Clara agreed. "Find something interesting?" "I'm finding out." The woman nodded, accepting the non-answer with a grace that suggested she was accustomed to respecting boundaries. She mentioned something about the property's history, about previous owners who had been private people, about how the land had a reputation for being more trouble than it was worth. The comment was offered casually, but Clara heard the question beneath it. She thanked the woman and returned to the site without elaborating. But the exchange marked a turning point. The quiet was ending. The discovery, once contained within the chamber's stone walls, was beginning to seep upward into the world above, carried by the same invisible currents that had once carried the breath of cool air through a seam in the stone. Gerald called. This time his tone was different. The authority was still there, but beneath it she detected something she had never heard from him before. Uncertainty. "I'm hearing things," he said. "People saying you found something out at the property. Something big." Clara waited. "Clara, if there's something going on, the family has a right to know. Martin was our blood. Whatever he left behind belongs to all of us in some way." The sentence hung in the air between them, revealing more than Gerald perhaps intended. Clara noted how quickly worthless had become belongs to all of us, how the same voices that had urged her to walk away were now reaching for a claim. "The property was left to me," Clara said. "Martin's will was specific." "Wills can be challenged." "They can." She let the silence do the rest. Gerald's breathing changed, the measured exhale of a man recalculating his approach. When he spoke again, his voice carried an attempt at warmth that felt both late and insufficient. "Clara, I'm not trying to fight you. I'm just saying, if there's something valuable there, we should be having a conversation. As family." "We're having one," Clara said. "And when there's something to share, I'll share it. On my terms." She ended the call. The satisfaction she felt was quieter than she had expected, closer to closure than to triumph. Gerald's reaction confirmed what she had always known about the family's relationship to her. She was tolerated when she was small. She would be contested when she was not. Patricia called the next day, her approach softer, wrapped in the language of concern that had always been her preferred instrument. "Honey, Gerald's beside himself. He thinks you're shutting the family out. We just want to make sure you're okay, that you're not being taken advantage of. These appraisal people, are they legitimate? Have you checked their credentials? You know how these things can go when a woman alone gets involved with something bigger than she's used to handling." The condescension was so familiar, it almost felt comforting. Clara had heard variations of this speech for 22 years. The implication was always the same. Clara could not be trusted with complexity. Clara needed guidance. Clara's judgment was suspect because Clara was Clara, and Clara had never been the kind of woman who handled things. "I appreciate your concern, Patricia," Clara said. "Everything is being handled professionally." "But who's advising you? Who's looking out for your interests?" "I am." The pause that followed was Patricia's silence. The silence of a woman who had never imagined those two words in that order from Clara's mouth. Raymond's call came through Elise, as before. But this time, Elise's voice carried something other than weariness. It carried a sharpness that Clara recognized as protective anger. "Raymond says he's consulting a lawyer," Elise reported. "He says Martin never should have inherited the property in the first place, that Dennis intended it for the whole family. He's talking about contesting the will." "Let him talk," Clara said. Mom, are you sure you've got this under control? Because it sounds like things are escalating. Things are always escalating when people find out something is worth more than they thought. Elise was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, but she asked the question she had been holding back since Clara's first phone call about the property. Mom, what did you find? Clara closed her eyes. The chamber appeared behind her lids, golden and still, waiting as it had always waited. She thought about what Calloway had told her, about the numbers that were still being refined, about the specialists who were still working, about the painting that might rewrite a chapter of art history. She thought about Martin, who had held the property without explanation, and about Dennis, who had done the same, and about whoever had built the chamber in the first place, layering wealth beneath the earth with the patience of someone planting seeds they never expected to harvest. I found what Martin left me, Clara said. Yeah, and it's enough. The word enough carried more weight than any number Calloway could have provided. It carried 22 years of being told she was not enough. It carried months of grief measured in unpaid bills and unanswered questions. It carried the memory of Gerald's voice dismissing her, Patricia's voice pitying her, Raymond's voice calculating what he might claim from her. Enough. The word was small, but the life it promised was not. Elise heard it. Whatever she understood from that single word was enough to change the texture of her silence. When she spoke again, her voice was different, not disbelieving, not cautious, something closer to recognition. Okay, Mom, she said. Okay. The appraisal continued. Calloway's team worked with a thoroughness that Clara found both reassuring and exhausting. Each item was catalogued, photographed, measured, and assessed against databases of known collections, auction records, and historical inventories. The process generated a paper trail that grew daily, filling folders that Clara stored in a locked cabinet the attorneys had recommended she purchase. The numbers refined themselves slowly, moving from estimates to figures, from figures to confirmed values. The gold bullion was authenticated at $147 million. The numismatic collection, after individual assessment of over 300 coins, was valued at $52 million, with several pieces flagged as potentially priceless pending further research. The historical artifacts, including the navigational instruments, the clock, the jade figurines, and the leather-bound books, added another $28 million in aggregate. And the paintings. The conservator's preliminary assessment was confirmed by 2 additional experts, both of whom traveled to the site at Calloway's request. The small landscape was attributed, with growing confidence, to a master whose works rarely appeared on the open market and whose missing pieces were the subject of decades of scholarly pursuit. The valuation placed on that single painting, subject to final authentication, was $87 million. The total, when Calloway presented it to Clara in a meeting that included both attorneys and a financial advisor the team had retained, was $314 million. Clara heard the number. She felt the room adjust around her, as though the walls and ceiling had shifted to accommodate something that had not been there before. And the faces around the table watched her, waiting for a reaction that would tell them how to proceed. She thought about the apartment, the stuck lock, the smell of other people's dinners in the hallway, the kitchen table where she had eaten standing up because sitting down alone felt like giving in. She thought about Martin, the quiet man who had carried a secret beneath his silence the way the earth had carried the chamber beneath its surface. She thought about Gerald, who had called it a liability, Patricia, who had called it worthless, Raymond, who had offered to take it off her hands. She thought about the bricks, the pile of bricks, the exact words the attorney had used, the exact words Elise had repeated, the exact words that had followed her through months of grief like a verdict on everything she had ever been. And $314 million, beneath a pile of bricks. Clara folded her hands on the table, the same gesture she had made in the attorney's office the day the will was read, and looked at the people assembled around her. "What do we do first?" she asked, and the room began to move. The days that followed the formal appraisal carried a velocity Clara had not experienced since the weeks after Martin's diagnosis, when time had accelerated and compressed simultaneously, too fast to process and too slow to endure. But where that period had moved toward diminishment, this one moved toward construction. Decisions multiplied. Conversations branched into tributaries of legal, financial, and logistical detail. Every answer generated 3 new questions, and every question required people whose expertise Clara had never imagined needing. The attorneys moved first, establishing a legal framework that would protect Clara's ownership while satisfying the reporting obligations that a discovery of this magnitude demanded. A trust was created, its structure designed to shield the assets from contestation while allowing Clara to access the wealth in stages that were both tax-efficient and personally manageable. The language of the trust documents was dense and precise, every clause a defense against the claims that the attorneys knew would come. And the claims did come. Gerald retained a lawyer within a week of the news reaching Martin's family, though how it reached them, Clara never learned. The challenge was exactly what Clara's attorneys had anticipated. A contention that Martin's inheritance of the property from Dennis had been irregular, that the property should have been distributed among the broader family, that Clara's ownership by extension was flawed. The legal arguments were thin, built on speculation rather than evidence, but they were made loudly and with the full weight of Gerald's conviction that the world owed him more than it had delivered. Clara's attorneys responded with the quiet efficiency of people who had seen such challenges before and who understood that volume was not the same as substance. The will was clear. The inheritance was documented. The chain of ownership from Dennis to Martin to Clara was unbroken and legally sound. Raymond's separate attempt to contest, based on an even more tenuous claim that Dennis had verbally promised the property to another branch of the family, was dismissed before it reached a hearing. The verbal promise, unsupported by any written evidence, carried no legal weight. Patricia called once more during this period. Her voice had changed again, the concern replaced by something that sounded almost like grief. "Clara, I don't understand how this happened. We're family. Martin would have wanted us all to benefit." "Martin wanted me to have the property," Clara said. "He put it in writing. But he didn't know what was underneath it. If he had known, he would have told Gerald. He would have told all of us." Clara considered the statement. It was possible that Patricia was right. It was possible that Martin, had he known the full scope of what lay beneath the foundation, would have shared the information with his family. It was equally possible that he would not have. Martin had been a private man who kept his own counsel and who had learned, perhaps from watching his family's relationship with money and expectation, that sharing information was not the same as sharing trust. "I can't speak for what Martin would have done," Clara said. "I can only act on what he did." The conversation ended there, not with anger, but with a finality that Clara recognized as the closing of a door that had been ajar for too long. The family's claim on her life, their assumed authority over her choices, their quiet conviction that she existed within a hierarchy that placed her somewhere below their judgment, all of it ended in that sentence. She could not speak for Martin. She could only act on what he had left her. And what he had left her was not just a property or a fortune, it was a choice. The choice to be her own authority, to trust her own eyes, to follow her own resolve into the ground and back out again. The news spread through the county in the way that all extraordinary news spreads through small communities unevenly, with distortion and wonder competing for dominance. The property at the end of the dirt road, the condemned lot that had been the subject of nothing but indifference for decades, was suddenly the center of conversations in places Clara had never visited. The diner in town, the post office, the church parking lot, where opinions were exchanged with the solemnity of Scripture. People who had never met Clara formed opinions about her. She was lucky, they said. She was clever. And she was foolish for staying in a small apartment when she could have been living anywhere. She was brave for digging alone. She was reckless for not calling authorities sooner. The opinions were contradictory and confident, offered by people who had no stake in her life, but who had decided, as people often did, that proximity to an extraordinary event entitled them to a position on it. The neighbor who had stopped her truck, the woman who had asked about the activity with a directness Clara appreciated, became something of an intermediary between the property and the community. She did not gossip, but she did confirm, when asked, that something significant had been found and that the widow who owned the property was handling it with more composure than most people could have managed. The characterization was generous, and Clara was grateful for it, though she suspected it was offered less out of admiration than out of a quiet recognition that Clara's discovery reflected something about the community itself, about what had been overlooked, about what had been dismissed because looking more closely would have required effort that no one had been willing to expend. The county assessor's office, which had valued the property at a figure so small it could have been a rounding error, found itself the subject of uncomfortable questions. How had a parcel with a subterranean vault containing hundreds of millions of dollars in assets been assessed as essentially worthless? The answer, of course, was obvious. No one had looked. No one had measured the discrepancy between the foundation's footprint and the known structure. That no one had noticed that the ground around the lower walls was settled in patterns that suggested depth. No one had asked why a family had held on to the property for generations without developing it. The failure was not dramatic. It was the quiet, pervasive failure of assumption. The property looked worthless, and so it was treated as worthless. The woman who inherited it looked like someone who could not handle complexity, and so she was treated accordingly. The bricks on the surface told a story of ruin, and everyone who drove past accepted that story because accepting it was easier than questioning it. Clara thought about this often in the weeks that followed. She thought about how many times in her life she had been the property, assessed at a glance, valued by appearance, and dismissed because the surface showed nothing that warranted a second look. She had internalized that assessment for years, carrying it like a debt she owed to a world that had decided her worth without consulting her. The vault beneath the foundation had not changed who she was. She had been the same woman before she found it, the same woman who had sat in the attorney's office with her hands folded, the same woman who had driven down a dirt road alone, the same woman who had knelt in the earth and moved a stone that did not belong because she believed that what lay beneath deserved to be seen. The money did not make her more. It made her visible. And visibility, she was learning, was its own kind of power. Not because it changed how she saw herself, but because it changed how others were forced to see her. Yet Elise flew in 2 weeks after the appraisal was finalized. Clara met her at the airport, and the moment she saw her daughter walking through the terminal, a bag over one shoulder and the boy holding her hand, something broke open inside her that she had been holding shut for months. They embraced in the middle of the arrivals hall, the boy pressed between them, confused and delighted by the intensity of the greeting. In the car, Elise was quiet for a long time. The boy had fallen asleep in the back seat, his head tilted against the window, and the silence between mother and daughter felt spacious rather than strained. "I didn't believe you," Elise said finally. "When you first told me about the property, about going out there, I thought you were trying to find something that wasn't there because you couldn't accept that Dad was gone, and everything he left behind was just gone too." Clara kept her eyes on the road. "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't be. You were protecting me from disappointment. That's what you've always done." Elise shook her head. "No. I was protecting myself. If you were disappointed, I'd have to deal with it. I'd have to watch you hurt again. And I didn't think I could handle that on top of everything else." She paused. "I should have trusted you." "You're here now," Clara said. "That's enough." The word again. Enough. It had become a kind of compass for Clara, a way of orienting herself in a landscape that had changed so dramatically that the old landmarks were no longer reliable. Enough was not a limit. It was a foundation, a something to stand on while the world rearranged itself overhead. She took Elise to the property the next day. They left the boy with a sitter, a woman from the town who had offered her services with a warmth that Clara suspected was partly genuine and partly motivated by curiosity. The drive was quiet, Elise watching the landscape change as they left the main roads behind. When they arrived, Elise stood at the edge of the foundation for a long time without speaking. She looked at the bricks, the partial walls, the temporary structure that now covered the opening. She looked at the field, the road, the sky that stretched wide and indifferent above it all. "Dad held on to this," she said, "for years, and he never said a word." "No. Do you think he knew?" Clara had asked herself the same question every day since the discovery. She had turned it over in her mind, from every angle, examining it the way Calloway's specialists examined the objects in the vault. And she had arrived at an answer that was not certain, but felt true. "I think he knew the property was special. I think Dennis told him something, maybe not everything, but something that made him hold on. And I think your father, being your father, decided to wait until he understood it fully before he said anything to anyone. He was never a man who spoke before he was sure. And then he got sick. And then he got sick." They stood together in the silence of the field, the foundation between them, the vault beneath it, the past and the future pressing against each other like hands in prayer. Elise reached for her mother's hand and held it, and Clara let herself be held, the touch grounding her in a present that was richer and stranger and more beautiful than any version of her life she had ever imagined. "Show me," Elise said, and Clara led her daughter down the stairs into the dark, toward the light that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. Elise did not speak when she entered the chamber. Clara had expected questions, exclamations, the kind of verbal processing that her daughter relied on when the world delivered something larger than anticipated. Instead, Elise stood in the doorway, the headlamp casting its steady cone across the shelves and alcoves, and was silent in a way that reminded Clara so sharply of Martin that her chest tightened with a pain she thought she had outgrown. The silence lasted nearly a full minute. Elise's eyes moved across the gold, the coins, the paintings, the objects arranged with a precision that spoke of care spanning generations. Her hand remained on the door frame, fingers pressing into the stone as if confirming that the surface was real, that the chamber was not a projection of grief or desperation, but a physical space containing physical things that could be touched and measured and valued. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and the words she chose were not about the gold or the money or the magnitude of what surrounded her. "He must have been so lonely," Elise said, "carrying this." Clara looked at her daughter and understood then that Elise was not speaking only about the property or the vault. She was speaking about Martin, about the weight of a secret held in silence across decades. As about a man who had sat at dinner tables and driven to work and kissed his wife goodnight while knowing, or at least suspecting, that beneath a pile of bricks in the eastern part of the county, something extraordinary waited in the dark. The loneliness of that knowledge settled into the chamber like dust. Clara felt it in her bones, in the ache that had lived there since the morning Martin stopped recognizing her face. He had not been a man who shared burdens easily. He had been a man who believed that protection meant absorption, that love meant shielding those you cared for from the weight of what you carried. The vault, the property, the years of quiet tax payments, all of it was consistent with the man she had known. He had held the secret not because he did not trust her, but because he had not yet found a way to share it that felt safe enough, complete enough, worthy of the truth it contained. And then time had run out. Elise turned to Clara, her eyes bright in the lamplight, and something passed between them that did not require words. An understanding, a shared recognition that the fortune surrounding them was not merely monetary. It was the physical manifestation of a man's hope, preserved in stone and silence, waiting for the women he loved to find it when they needed it most. They climbed back into the daylight together. The field was golden with late afternoon sun, the weeds casting long shadows across the bricks. Elise sat on the edge of the foundation, her legs dangling over the stone, and looked out at the land with an expression Clara had not seen on her daughter's face in years. It was the expression of someone who had been given permission to stop surviving and start living. "What are you going to do?" Elise asked. Clara sat beside her, their shoulders touching, the warmth of contact simple and necessary. "I've been thinking about that," Clara said. "For weeks. Since before the appraisal, since before the numbers came in, I've been thinking about what this means. Not just the money. What it means that this was here, that Martin held on to it, that I found it because I refused to walk away." She paused, watching a hawk circle high above the field, riding currents invisible from the ground. "I'm not going to disappear into it," she continued. "I've seen what sudden wealth does to people who don't have a foundation under it. They spend and they spend, and they wake up 10 years later and they've bought everything except the thing they actually needed. I'm not going to do that." "What do you actually need?" Clara smiled. It was a small smile, private and unforced, the kind that arrived only when the truth beneath it was genuine. "Time," she said. "I need time. I need time without fear, time without counting, time to sit somewhere and not calculate what sitting there is costing me. I need Elise and the boy to have that too. That's what I need first. Everything else is architecture." The architecture began within weeks. Clara's legal and financial team, now expanded to include a wealth manager and an estate planner, worked with her to construct a framework that would preserve, grow, and distribute the fortune in ways that aligned with her values rather than her circumstances. The distinction mattered to her. For the first time in her life, she was making decisions from abundance rather than scarcity, and the shift required a discipline she had not anticipated. Scarcity made choices simple. You took what you could and held on. Abundance made choices complex. You had to decide not just what to take, but what to build, what to give, and what to leave alone. The first thing she did was pay off every debt, not just her own. Elise's student loans, the medical bills that had accumulated during Martin's illness, the credit card balances that had grown like weeds during the months when income stopped but expenses did not. The act of writing those checks, or rather, and of authorizing the transfers that accomplished the same thing, carried a weight that surprised her. Each payment was a severance, a cutting of a cord that had bound her to anxiety for years. When the last one was complete, she sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had eaten standing up, and felt something unfamiliar settle into her body. It took her several minutes to identify it. It was the absence of dread. She had carried dread for so long that its departure left a space she did not yet know how to fill. The apartment was the next thing to go, not because she suddenly craved luxury, but because the space had become a container for a version of herself that no longer existed. The stuck lock, the hallway that smelled of other people's lives, and the windows that looked out on a parking lot where children rode bicycles between cars. She had been grateful for it. She would not pretend otherwise. Shelter was shelter, and she had known periods without it. But gratitude did not require permanence. She found a house, modest by the standards her new wealth permitted, but spacious enough for Elise and the boy to have their own rooms when they visited, which she intended to be often. It had a porch. She had always wanted a porch. The desire felt almost embarrassingly simple in the context of $314 million, but simplicity was what she trusted. She had learned through years of having very little that the things that mattered most were the things that did not require explanation. Elise moved closer. Not into Clara's house, because both women understood that proximity and enmeshment were different things, but into the same county, near enough that the drive between them could be made on impulse rather than by appointment. The boy started at a new school, one where the class sizes were smaller and the teachers had time to notice when a child was struggling. Elise found work she did not hate, then work she actually liked, then, eventually, the freedom to pursue the kind of work she had always wanted but could never afford to chase. Clara watched these transformations from a careful distance, providing support without direction, offering resources without conditions. She had spent her life being told what to do with what little she had. She would not repeat that pattern with her daughter, no matter how much she had to give. The property itself underwent a transformation that Clara oversaw personally. The vault was secured by professionals, its contents transferred to climate-controlled storage facilities that met museum standards. The process took weeks and required a level of logistical coordination that would have overwhelmed her a year earlier. Now, surrounded by competent people who respected her judgment and valued her decisions, she managed it with a composure that surprised even herself. The items were insured, cataloged, and placed under the care of institutions that understood their significance. The painting, the small landscape that had drawn the conservator's breathless attention, was authenticated. The announcement rippled through the art world with a force that Clara observed from the outside, reading accounts of her discovery in publications she had never heard of, seeing her name in sentences that also contained words like unprecedented and historically significant. She did not give interviews. The requests came daily from newspapers, magazines, television networks, documentary producers. Each one promised to tell her story with sensitivity and respect. Each one wanted access, images, quotes, the raw material from which narratives were constructed by people who had not lived them. Clara declined them all. Her story was not a product. It was not content. It was a life, her life, and she chose to live it rather than perform it. The money, once it became publicly known, changed the landscape around her in ways both predictable and strange. People she had never met wrote letters. Some were kind, congratulatory, genuinely moved by the idea that a widow who had been given a pile of bricks had found a fortune beneath them. Others were less kind. Requests for money arrived with the regularity of bills, some desperate, some calculated, some wrapped in anger, as though Clara's wealth was an accusation against their poverty. She read them all and responded to none, not out of indifference, but out of an understanding that individual requests could not be answered without a framework. And the framework she wanted to build would take time. The framework she eventually created was a foundation, a deliberate echo of the word that had defined the property and, by extension, her journey. The Clara and Martin Voss Foundation was established with an initial endowment that made headlines Clara did not read. Its mission was specific and personal, and providing support for widows and single parents facing financial crisis, funding programs that addressed the gap between sudden loss and institutional aid, and creating opportunities for people who had been dismissed by systems that assessed value by appearance rather than substance. The foundation's work was quiet, deliberate, and effective. Clara did not attach her name to buildings or programs. She did not attend galas or accept awards. She sat in meetings, reviewed proposals, and made decisions with the same careful attention she had brought to every aspect of her life, from balancing a grocery budget to prying loose a stone that sealed a passage no one believed existed. The people who worked with her came to understand quickly that Clara's authority was not derived from her wealth. It was derived from her character. As she had been the same woman before the discovery, the money had simply given the world a reason to pay attention. Gerald's legal challenge was dismissed within 3 months. The court's ruling was brief and definitive, citing the unbroken chain of ownership and the specificity of Martin's will. Gerald did not call after the ruling. Neither did Patricia. The silence from Martin's family settled into Clara's life like the closing of an account that had been overdrawn for years. She did not celebrate their absence. She did not mourn it. She simply noticed it, the way one notices when a persistent noise finally stops, and the quiet that follows feels louder than the sound ever was. Raymond's challenge fared even worse. His attorney withdrew from the case before it reached a hearing, citing insufficient grounds. Now, Raymond himself made one final attempt to contact Clara through Elise, a message that combined indignation with an appeal for reconsideration that might have been more persuasive if it had not included the phrase, "You owe this family." Elise relayed the message with a flatness that suggested she had already decided how to respond. "I told him that the family had 22 years to treat you like you mattered," Elise said, "and that the fact they're only interested now tells everyone everything they need to know." Clara did not ask what Raymond had said in return. The conversation was over. It had been over since the day she signed the papers in the attorney's office and accepted a property that no one else had wanted. The community around the property evolved in the months that followed. The dirt road that had once been a suggestion was graded and improved, not by Clara but by the county, which had suddenly discovered an interest in infrastructure that served a site of historical significance. The neighbor who had stopped her truck began to wave rather than simply slow down. Other residents of the area, people who had maintained their distance during Clara's early visits, found reasons to introduce themselves, to mention that they had always thought the property had potential, to observe that sometimes the things people overlooked were the things most worth finding. Clara received these overtures with grace and without illusion. She understood that her social value had changed in direct proportion to her financial value, and she did not resent the correlation. People were people. They responded to what was visible, and she had responded the same way for most of her life, accepting the assessments placed upon her because they were delivered with confidence, and she had lacked the evidence to contradict them. The evidence was different now, not because she had changed, but because the world had been forced to revise its estimate. The first anniversary of Martin's death arrived on a Tuesday, unremarkable in weather, indistinguishable from the days that surrounded it. Clara drove to the cemetery alone, carrying flowers she had picked from the garden of her new house, flowers that grew wild along the fence line and that Martin would have recognized as the kind that required no care and no attention, the kind that simply persisted because persistence was in their nature. She sat beside the stone for a long time. The engraving was simple. Name, dates, and nothing more. Martin had not been a man who required epitaphs. His life had been his statement, and the statement had been clear to those who knew how to read it. Steady, present, enduring. A man who built things with his hands and held things in his silence, and trusted that the people he loved would eventually understand what he could not bring himself to say. Clara spoke to him, not aloud, not in the theatrical way that grief sometimes demanded, but internally, in the language they had shared for 22 years, the language of proximity and familiarity, and the slow accumulation of understanding that only time could produce. She told him about the property, about the stairway and the door and the chamber that waited beneath the bricks. She told him about the gold, the coins, the painting that had made a conservator forget to breathe. She told him about the numbers, the appraisals, the legal battles fought and won against the family that had never quite accepted her. She told him about Elise, about the boy growing taller, about the porch where she sat in the evenings and watched the sky change color in ways she had never had time to notice before. And she told him that she understood. Not everything, not the full scope of what he had known or when he had known it, but enough. She understood that he had held on to the property because letting it go would have meant letting go of a possibility that he could not yet name. She understood that his silence had been protection, not deception. She understood that the pile of bricks, the condemned lot, the worthless inheritance that everyone had told her to abandon, had been Martin's final act of faith. Not in the property, not in the vault, in her. In the woman who would not walk away from something simply because others told her it held no value. The tears came then, quiet and warm, falling onto the grass beside the stone. They were not tears of grief, though grief was woven through them like a thread that would never fully unravel. They were tears of completion, of a circle closing, of a conversation that had begun 22 years ago in a small ceremony with 14 guests and had continued through illness and loss and silence and discovery until it arrived here at a graveside with flowers in one hand and a fortune in the other, and a woman who finally understood that the greatest inheritance Martin had left her was not buried beneath stone. It was the belief that she was worth more than anyone, including herself, had ever dared to assume. She placed the flowers against the stone and pressed her palm to the surface, feeling the warmth of the day radiating from the engraved letters. The stone was solid, permanent, unyielding. Like the foundation of the property, like the walls of the vault, like the quiet certainty that had carried her from an attorney's office to a condemned lot to a hidden chamber to this moment, where everything that had been taken away was returned in a form she could never have predicted. She stood, wiped her eyes, and walked back to her car. The cemetery was peaceful, its rows of stones stretching across a gentle slope, each one marking a life that had ended and a story that continued in the people who remained. Clara was one of those people now, a continuer, a carrier of something that had been entrusted to her by a man who had chosen her above all others and who had left her the only thing he had that money could not diminish or time could not erode: trust. The months that followed settled into a rhythm that Clara had never known but recognized immediately as the life she had been building toward without understanding it. The foundation grew, its programs reaching women and families in circumstances that mirrored her own past with an accuracy that sometimes made her chest ache. She read their applications personally, each one a story of loss and determination that she understood from the inside out. She did not pity them. Pity was what Patricia had offered, and Clara knew its hollowness from decades of receiving it. What she offered instead was practical support delivered without judgment. On the kind of help that said, "I believe you can build something, here are the tools." The boy, Elise's son, became a regular presence in Clara's life. He called her Nana and arrived at her house with the proprietary confidence of a child who understood that this place was partly his. He explored the yard, climbed the fence, asked questions about everything with a relentlessness that reminded Clara of Martin at his most engaged. She answered what she could and admitted when she could not, modeling the kind of honesty she wished someone had offered her when she was too young to demand it. One afternoon, sitting on the porch while the boy chased something invisible across the lawn, Elise asked a question that Clara had been expecting for months. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had listened to them? If you had sold the property or let the county take it?" Clara watched the boy stop, crouch, and examine something in the grass with the focused intensity of a scientist discovering a new species. The sun was low, the light warm, the kind of evening that made you believe the world was kinder than evidence suggested. "I think about it sometimes," she said. Not with regret, more with curiosity. What would my life look like if I had been the person they assumed I was? If I had taken Gerald's advice and walked away? If I had believed Patricia when she told me it was worthless? And I think I would still be in that apartment, with the stuck lock and the hallway that smelled like other people's dinners. I would be applying for jobs I did not want and eating standing up at a kitchen table I was afraid to sit at alone. I would be fine. I would survive. I have always survived. But surviving is not the same as living, and I spent too many years confusing the two. Elise was quiet for a moment. The boy had found a stick and was using it to conduct an invisible orchestra, his movements wild and unself-conscious in the way only children's movements could be. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Elise said. "The bricks, just the bricks themselves. How everyone looked at them and saw rubble, saw waste, saw something to be cleared away. And you looked at them and saw that they were arranged, that someone had moved them, that they were not just sitting there, they were placed." Clara nodded. "That's what I keep coming back to," Elise continued. "Not the gold, not the paintings, not the $300 million. The fact that you noticed the bricks were placed. And that one observation changed everything. And nobody else made it because nobody else bothered to look." The statement settled between them with the weight of something that had been true for a long time and had only now found its words. Clara felt it land and did not try to deflect it. She had spent her life deflecting, minimizing, redirecting praise toward circumstances or luck or other people's contributions. She was learning slowly that accepting recognition was not the same as claiming more than she deserved. She had looked. She had noticed. She had acted. The fortune was a consequence, but the cause was her. She allowed that thought to exist without qualification, and it felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of balancing on surfaces that shifted with every step. As the vault's contents continued to reveal their significance over the following year. Provenance research traced the collection to a family of industrialists who had accumulated wealth across multiple continents during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Their fortune, vast and diversified, had been threatened by political upheaval, economic collapse, and the wars that reshaped the world during the first half of the 20th century. Rather than trust banks or governments or the shifting loyalties of business partners, they had chosen to preserve a portion of their wealth in the most ancient and reliable way available. They had buried it. The property had been the site of their country estate, the structure above the vault, a grand house that had deteriorated over decades of abandonment until only its foundation remained. The family's line had thinned and scattered, and the knowledge of the vault had passed from generation to generation in increasingly fragmented form until it reached Dennis, who had acquired the property through a distant family connection and who had understood enough to hold on to it but not enough, or perhaps not been brave enough, to open it. Dennis had passed the property to Martin. Martin had passed it to Clara. And Clara, the widow who had been given just a pile of bricks, had done what neither of the men before her had managed to do. She had gone down. She had opened the door. She had faced what waited in the dark and brought it into the light. The historians who pieced together the provenance spoke of it with a reverence that Clara found both touching and slightly bewildering. To them, the vault was not merely a repository of wealth. It was a time capsule, a window into an era when the world's financial systems were in flux, and those who held great fortunes trusted the earth more than they trusted institutions. The industrialist family had chosen this location not at random, but because the geology of the area provided natural advantages for long-term preservation. The soil composition, the water table, the temperature stability at the depth they had chosen, all of it had been considered and tested before the first stone was laid. The vault was not a hiding place improvised in panic. It was an engineering project executed with the same seriousness as the factories and mines that had generated the wealth it contained. The family's decline was gradual and, to the historians, predictable. Fortunes of that era were fragile in ways that modern wealth often was not. They depended on political stability, trade agreements, labor conditions, and the health of markets that could collapse without warning. When the world changed, as it did repeatedly during the early 20th century, the family's visible wealth evaporated. Businesses closed, properties were sold, family members dispersed to other states, other countries, other lives. What remained, invisible and untouched beneath the earth, was the portion they had set aside against exactly this kind of catastrophe. The irony was not lost on Clara. The family had built the vault as insurance against loss, and in doing so, they had lost access to it. The knowledge of its location had been diluted across generations, reduced from precise instructions to vague references to half-remembered stories told at reunions that grew smaller each year. By the time Dennis acquired the property, the vault was less a certainty than a rumor, a family legend that had ossified into something between myth and hope. Dennis, cautious by nature and uncertain by circumstance, had done what he could. He had held the land. He had kept it from being claimed. He had trusted that someone someday would have the courage or the necessity to dig deeper than he had. That someone had been Clara, not because she was braver than Dennis or smarter than Martin, because she had nothing left to lose. The combination of grief, financial pressure, and the stubborn refusal to accept the judgment of people who had never looked at her closely enough to see what she was capable of, had driven her to the one place no one else had thought to go: downward. She reflected on this often, the role that desperation had played in her discovery. It was not a comfortable thought. She did not want to romanticize the suffering that had preceded the find, the months of counting coins, the nights of lying awake calculating how long her savings would last. The slow humiliation of becoming a woman whose circumstances were visible in her posture, her clothes, the way she hesitated before every purchase. Those experiences had shaped her, yes, but they had also harmed her, eroding a confidence she had once carried naturally and replacing it with a vigilance that never fully relaxed. The vault had not erased those scars. $314 million did not undo the memory of standing in a grocery store and putting items back because the total was climbing too fast. It did not erase the knowledge of what it felt like to receive a medical bill that exceeded her annual income, or the specific shame of being unable to provide for her daughter in the way she had always promised herself she would. The money changed her future. It could not retroactively change her past, and she was learning that the two existed simultaneously, not as contradictions, but as layers, each one informing the other, each one necessary for understanding the full shape of who she was. The historical significance of the collection attracted attention from museums, universities, and institutions that dealt in the kind of wealth that doubled as cultural heritage. Clara negotiated with them carefully, on terms that reflected not just the monetary value of the items, but their meaning. Several pieces were loaned to public institutions, their display accompanied by plaques that told the story of their preservation and discovery. The painting, now confirmed as a masterwork that had been missing for over a century, was exhibited in a gallery that drew visitors from around the world. Clara attended the opening, standing at the back of the room, watching strangers look at something she had found beneath the earth with nothing but a headlamp and the stubborn refusal to believe what she had been told. A woman approached her at the gallery opening. She was younger than Clara, dressed with the careful elegance of someone who attended these events regularly. She introduced herself as a journalist, though she was quick to clarify that she was not seeking an interview. She had followed the story of the discovery and had been moved by it, not by the scale of the fortune, but by the circumstances of the woman who had found it. "What strikes me," the journalist said, "is that the vault was there the whole time, beneath a property that had been assessed, inspected, driven past, and dismissed by hundreds of people over decades. It was right there, and the only person who found it was the one everyone assumed had the least ability to recognize what she was looking at." Clara considered the observation. It was astute, if perhaps more poetic than the reality warranted. She had not set out to prove anything, and she had set out to understand what Martin had left her. The fortune was a consequence of that understanding, not its goal. "I did not find it because I was looking for treasure," Clara said. "I found it because I was paying attention. There is a difference." The journalist nodded slowly, and Clara could see her committing the words to memory. She did not mind. The distinction mattered to her. Treasure hunters looked for value. She had looked for truth. The fact that the two had coincided was not luck. It was the natural result of refusing to accept a surface that did not match what lay beneath it. The exhibition catalog mentioned her by name. The description was brief and factual. Discovered by Clara Voss during the excavation of a condemned property she had inherited from her late husband. The sentence was plain, unremarkable in its construction, but Clara read it several times, each reading settling deeper into a part of herself that had been hollow for too long. Discovered by Clara Voss. 3 words that erased decades of dismissal, not through argument or revenge, but through the simple, irrefutable record of what she had done. She did not frame the catalog page. She did not need to. The evidence of her discovery lived in the chamber beneath the foundation, in the accounts that funded the work of her foundation, in the face of her grandson as he ran across the lawn of a house she owned, in the voice of her daughter who no longer carried the weight of financial fear, in the quiet mornings on the porch where she sat with coffee that she drank slowly, without counting what it cost or calculating what came next. As she thought about Martin on those mornings, not with the sharp, consuming grief of the early months, but with a tenderness that had matured into something durable. He had given her everything he could, not just the property, not just the vault, but the example of holding on to something you believed in even when no one else could see its value. He had held on to the land. He had held on to their marriage. He had held on to a quiet faith in the future that his illness had tried to erase, but that the foundation beneath the bricks had preserved. She understood, with a clarity that felt like sunlight, that the discovery was not the point. The discovery was the confirmation. The point was the choice. The choice to look when everyone said there was nothing to see. The choice to dig when everyone said the ground was empty. The choice to descend into the dark when every comfortable, sensible, reasonable voice in her life had told her to stay on the surface and accept what was visible. Clara had chosen otherwise, and in choosing otherwise, she had found not just a fortune, but herself. The property in the eastern part of the county still stood. The foundation remained, its stone walls visible above the earth, the bricks arranged around it in piles that looked, to the casual observer, like the remnants of something that had failed. The dirt road still narrowed as it left the main route, and the weeds still grew tall in the summer, brushing against the underside of whatever vehicle made the journey. But now a small marker stood at the edge of the property, placed there at Clara's request. It was simple. A stone set into the earth with an inscription that said nothing about gold or paintings or $314 million. It said only this: what is overlooked is not the same as what is absent. Clara had written the words herself, sitting on her porch on an evening when the sky was changing color and the boy was asleep inside, and Elise was reading in the next room, and the world, for once, was asking nothing of her except to be present in it. The words were not a monument. They were a reminder. For anyone who passed the property and wondered what had happened there. For anyone who had been told that what they held was worthless. For anyone who stood at the edge of a condemned lot, a broken marriage, a depleted bank account, a life that others had assessed and dismissed, and who wondered whether there was something more beneath the surface. There was. There always was. The question was never whether the depth existed. The question was whether someone was willing to look. Clara had looked, and what she found had changed everything, not because the gold was there, but because she was. On a quiet evening, months after the last legal challenge had been resolved and the last specialist had completed their work, Clara sat on her porch and watched the sun lower itself behind the tree line with the unhurried patience of something that had performed the same act billions of times and intended to perform it billions more. The boy was in the yard, older now, his legs longer, his movements less chaotic and more purposeful. Elise sat in the chair beside her, a book open on her lap, unread for the last 20 minutes. And the house behind them was warm. The porch light would come on soon, automatically, a small luxury that Clara still noticed every time it happened. Inside, the kitchen held food that she had bought without checking prices. The closet held clothes that fit. The drawers held documents that confirmed, in language so precise it left no room for doubt, that the woman who lived here owned what she had found and what she had built from it. Clara rocked gently in the chair she had chosen for this porch, a chair that Martin would have liked for its simplicity, its honest construction, its refusal to pretend to be anything other than what it was. She thought about the apartment, the attorney's office, the dirt road, the bricks, the stone that did not belong, the stairway descending into the dark, the door, the chamber, the gold. She thought about every voice that had told her to walk away, Gerald's authority, Patricia's pity, Raymond's calculation, the attorney's careful neutrality, even Elise's gentle skepticism. Each voice had carried the same message, delivered in different tones. There is nothing there. Move on. She had not moved on. She had moved down, into the earth, into the unknown, into the space between what the world assumed and what actually existed. And in that space, she had found something that exceeded every estimate, every assessment, every judgment that had ever been placed upon her. The evening settled. The boy came inside, trailing grass and the particular exhaustion of a child who had used the day fully. Elise closed her book and stretched. The house absorbed them, its rooms lit and warm, its walls solid and honest, its foundation, yet like Clara's own, built to hold more than anyone looking at the surface would ever have guessed. Clara remained on the porch a few minutes longer, alone with the darkening sky and the sound of crickets beginning their nightly work. She thought of Martin one last time, not with longing but with gratitude, the kind that did not ache but settled softly, like snow on a field, covering everything in quiet. There were still moments when the magnitude of her transformation caught her off guard. Small moments, usually. She would reach for her wallet at a store and pause. The old instinct to check the balance before committing still alive in her fingers, even though the balance could now absorb whatever she placed before it. She would wake in the middle of the night and lie still, listening for the sounds of the apartment, the neighbors above, and the parking lot below, before remembering that the sounds surrounding her now were different. Wind in trees she owned, a house settling into foundations she had chosen, the breathing of a life she had built rather than borrowed. These moments were not painful. They were instructive. They reminded her of where she had been, and in reminding her, they prevented the kind of amnesia that wealth sometimes imposed on those who acquired it suddenly. She had read about lottery winners who, within years of their windfall, could no longer remember what it felt like to worry about groceries. Clara did not intend to forget. The worry had been part of her for too long to simply discard. Instead, she carried it the way one carried a key to a house no longer occupied. Not because it opened anything, but because it represented a place she had lived and a self she had been. And that self deserved acknowledgement, even as she moved beyond it. The foundation's work continued to grow. Within the first year, it had provided direct assistance to over 200 families, each one navigating the specific devastation that followed the loss of a primary earner or the collapse of a financial structure that had appeared stable. Clara reviewed every case personally, not because her staff could not handle the work, but because the act of reading those stories kept her connected to a reality that her new circumstances might otherwise have obscured. She knew what it felt like to sit across from someone who held your future in a folder. She knew the weight of a number that was too small, and she knew the silence that followed the sentence. There is nothing else. Her staff learned to bring her the most difficult cases, the ones where standard criteria suggested denial, but where the underlying story suggested possibility. Clara had an instinct for these, a way of reading between the lines of applications that came not from training, but from experience. She recognized the language of people who had been told no so many times that they had begun to write their requests in the voice of apology rather than need. She recognized the specific courage it took to ask for help when the world had made it clear that asking was an imposition. And she responded to that courage with the only thing she had ever wanted someone to give her: belief. Simple, practical, demonstrated belief that the person asking was worth the investment. And the boy grew. That was the part Clara thought about most when she allowed herself to measure the distance between her old life and her new one. He grew taller, louder, more certain of himself in the way children became when the adults around them were no longer vibrating with anxiety. He asked for things without the careful calculation she had noticed in him before, the subtle awareness that requests could burden, that wanting things had a cost that extended beyond money. Now he wanted openly, freely, with the magnificent selfishness of a child who understood at some level too deep for language that his needs would be met. That freedom was Clara's greatest accomplishment, not the vault, not the fortune, not the foundation or the gallery exhibitions or the legal victories over relatives who had never earned the loyalty they demanded. Had the boy's freedom from fear. That was what $314 million had purchased. Not things, not luxury, not status. The absence of dread in a child's eyes. If the entire fortune had bought nothing else, Clara would have considered it sufficient. Elise saw it too. Mother and daughter spoke of it sometimes in the evenings, their conversations carrying a depth that had not been available to them when every exchange was shadowed by the unspoken question of whether there was enough money, enough time, enough energy to maintain the fiction that everything was fine when it manifestly was not. The removal of that fiction, the replacement of it with an honest abundance that did not require performance, had changed their relationship in ways that Clara was still discovering. They were gentler with each other now. Not softer, Clara was still capable of the directness that Elise sometimes flinched at, and Elise was still capable of the stubbornness that Clara recognized as her own. But the gentleness came from security, from the knowledge that disagreements did not threaten the foundation of their relationship, because that foundation was no longer built on survival. It was built on choice. They were together because they wanted to be, not because the alternative was unaffordable. On a Saturday morning, several months after the anniversary of Martin's death, Clara drove to the property one last time. Not for any practical purpose. The vault had been secured. The contents had been transferred. The foundation above ground had been stabilized by engineers who understood its historical significance and who had treated its preservation as a matter of professional pride. The stone marker she had placed at the edge of the land stood where she had set it, its inscription visible to anyone who cared to read it. She parked the car and walked the perimeter of the foundation as she had done on her first visit, months and a lifetime ago. The bricks were still there, still arranged in their loose piles, still bearing the faint markings of a manufacturer whose name had been forgotten by everyone except the earth that held them. The partial walls still stood, their height unchanged, their surfaces weathered by one more season of rain and sun. The weeds had been trimmed by the engineers, but they were growing back, reclaiming the space with the patient determination of things that did not recognize human boundaries. She stood where she had crouched to examine the seam in the stone. The trench she had dug was filled now, the opening sealed properly, its location marked only by a slight depression in the earth that would eventually disappear entirely. She pressed her boot against the ground and felt the solidity beneath it, the same solidity she had felt on that first day when the cool air had risen through the gap and brushed her face like a message she was not yet able to read. The message was clear to her now. It had always been clear. She had simply needed to learn the language. She looked out across the field. The land stretched toward a horizon that seemed, from this vantage point, to go on forever. The sky was wide and blue and indifferent, and as it had always been, offering nothing and withholding nothing, simply existing in the way that the largest things did, without agenda or opinion. A hawk circled high above, the same hawk or a descendant of the one she had watched on earlier visits, riding currents that were invisible from the ground, but perfectly real to those who knew how to find them. Clara breathed, deeply, fully, the way she had not breathed in years, with lungs that were not constricted by anxiety or grief, or the slow suffocation of a life lived in deference to other people's estimates of her worth. She was worth more than they had estimated. She had always been worth more. The vault had not created that worth. It had confirmed it. And the confirmation, she understood now, was not for her. She had known her worth all along, in the quiet, unarticulated way that people know things they cannot prove but refuse to abandon. The confirmation was for the world, for Gerald, for Patricia, for Raymond, for every person who had looked at her and seen only what was visible and had decided that what was visible was all there was. The world had been wrong, and Clara, standing on land she owned, above a vault she had discovered, surrounded by evidence that her persistence had value and her judgment had meaning, was the living proof of its error. She returned to her car. The drive home was peaceful, the road familiar, the landscape settling into evening with the unhurried grace of a place that had seen too many seasons to be impressed by any single one. She thought about the words on the stone marker and decided that they were right. What is overlooked is not the same as what is absent. And the sentence held within it everything she had learned, everything she had survived, everything she had found. She would carry those words for the rest of her life, not as a slogan or a motto, but as a truth she had excavated from the earth with her own hands, in her own time, on her own terms. "Thank you," she said, not to the sky, not to the memory, to the man who had trusted her with a pile of bricks and the faith that she would find what lay beneath them. The night arrived. The porch light came on, and Clara went inside, closing the door behind her on a day that required nothing more than what it had already given. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. I'll see you in the next story.